Where is this? What is good, everybody? Appreciate everybody for being here on the show. You about to get this on and popping. You know, I got to get this started.
Let's get one thing straight. Funky bass line kicks in. You have been taught a lie, a massive centuries-old lie. But the truth has a funky beat. This is for Dr. Ivor Van Sertima. They told you Columbus was the first to cross the sea. A 49er who did discovery, but the evidence is thick. The proof is on the case. A different kind of hero from a different time and space. Before the Nina Pinta and the Santa Maria sail came a wave of African king, sturdy on the gale. OLMEC heads in Mexico, with features strong and wide, Negroid noses, lips and locks, with nowhere left to hide. Dr. William dug them up, said the research is sound. 40 years in the field, on that hallowed ground. Sheikh Anta sent his praise across the water, making historical science flip and somersault. They were right. Ivan Van Sertima was right. The OLMECs were African, shining in the ancient light. That they crossed the water, bold and brave, upon the ocean's might. So let the funk drop heavy and set the record right. They were right. Ivan Van Sertima was right. Hey, Erdo built a boat of reeds, named it the Good Ship. Ra proved the Atlantic could be crossed the old school ancient way. From Mali, Abu Bakari, emperor with the dream, sent 1,000 ships on a transatlantic stream. Songhai Kanta ships could ride the current's flow. Dr. Kamagisha said y'all already know. Dr. Blout, the geographer, said the winds were blowing right. For West African mariners burning through the night. They found the skeletons, the script, the artifacts so fine. At Hope Bay in the Virgins laying on the burial line, with earthenware and tokens, a story to be told. History that's ancient, more precious than gold. They were right. Ivan Van Sertima was right. The OLMECs were African, shining in the ancient light. They crossed the water, bold and brave, upon the ocean's might. So let the funk drop heavy and set the record right. They were right. Ivan Van Sertima was right. The OLMECs were African, shining in the ancient light. They crossed the water, bold and brave, upon the ocean's might. So let the funk drop heavy and set the record right.
Hey,
Dr. John L. Sorensen.
shout out to everybody in the building.
Transoceanic
About to have a good time here.
Dr. Carl Schwerin on the
About to review
domestication timelines. Check the signs.
just a video
Mexican anthropologist didn't reject the black presence
on this topic. We're just going to review a very popular video on this topic. We're going to have a good time. It's another impromptu live.
The critique was political, ideological. They ignored the core evidence. That was Dr. Bernal. Now let's get back to the fight. They were right. Ivan Van Sertima was right. The OLMECs were the record right. They were right, they were right. Ivan Van Sertima was right. 35 scholars, a multidisciplinary groove. From archaeology, linguistics, history, they made their move. So
Give me a 1 if you can hear me in the chat. If you're listening in, shout out to everybody in the build.
Watch that narrative fail. Van Sertima.
We're about to get started once we get some folks. About to get this on and popping. All right, give me some ones. Give me some ones if you can hear me loud and clear. We're about to get this popping. You got to remember the time when we were great. Once I get some ones, we could just go ahead and start the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing well on this Sunday evening. We're having some good time with them good vibes. Shout out to Trigger in the build. Shout out to Ethio. Alright, we got some ones. Hope the music is at a good level. I want to keep it grooving. So what we're going to do is we're going to review this video. I'm going to stop it as I see fit, and then we're going to get a chance to respond to some of the claims. This is a video that purports to debunk, the idea that the OLMECs were Africans or influenced by Africans. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. Fair use, fair use. This is all fair use. So this is a channel, called African Origins of Civilization by Nick Barstow. What's good with Barry Payton? Now, the owner of this channel passed away. He passed away, but I just wanted to review this video on the channel. Not for any animosity, because I do think that these creators made their best attempt to be fair, but there were some misapprehensions that we're going to review here. So let's get into it.
Ladies and gentlemen, for this controversial topic today, I wanted someone who really specialized in the ancient Americas on YouTube. And who better to do that than none other than Pete from Ancient Americas. Pete, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
For those in my audience who may not be familiar with who you are and the awesome work that you do, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I run the Ancient Americas channel on YouTube. It's a channel that basically discusses the pre-Columbian history of North and South America, basically anything 1492, we cover it. It can be civilizations, it can be technology, it can be mythology. It's all fair game.
Before we begin this episode, at the very beginning, I want to encourage you, my subscribers, if you are not subscribed to Ancient Americas already, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to his channel and all of the awesome work he is doing to not just make history matter in general, but specifically the Ancient Americas. It's honestly a subject that does not get the attention that it deserves. And luckily for us, Pete is making strides to ensure that ancient American history matters. And because of that, because ancient America matters, because Native American history and the indigenous peoples and cultures throughout the Americas matter and have a right to ensure their history continues on as history rather than being appropriated by foreigners entirely, we wanted to make this episode that touches on a very controversial topic that's becoming even more mainstream today. And that is the question as to whether or not Olmec civilization is an African civilization. When you think of the Olmecs, who do you envision?
When I envision the Olmec, I see people of the Gulf Coast of Mexico. I kind of see them as visionaries, people who started out as, just simple maize and corn farmers who slowly over time must have realized the incredible potential that their culture and power had. I mean, from there, it's like they just turn up the volume to 11. There are so many aspects of Mesoamerican culture that we first see clear evidence of among the Olmec, like, the ball game, writing, art. This is a civilization of kings, astronomers, artists, and...
Yeah, I mean, this guy's an Americanist, and, what you'll find out is that the Americanist, similar to Africanist, they have their own framework. Now, most Americanist scholars are white, they're European, right? And, the idea of calling Sertima's position a conspiracy is it's really silly, honestly. Like, it's almost like even taking that seriously is a waste of time, because he was very, very thoroughly sourced. Agree or disagree with his work, one of the things that John Henry Clark said against Ivan van Sertima, was that he used European scholars. That was a critique that John Henry Clark gave that came before Columbus. He used too many Europeans. Now, in the follow-up text, which was edited by Renoka Rashidi, they included a lot more black scholars in the conversation. So that was a positive. But again, like, calling it conspiracy, well, like, what is the conspiracy? If the conspiracy is to hide black origins, that's not really a conspiracy. That's kind of a fact. That's a fact that we see in Western scholarship. They want to hide black origins. So that's not a conspiracy. That's something that's been proven. But let's get into it. Let's get more into it.
Engineers who left a gigantic impact on the area. Let's talk mainstream. When it comes to the great multitude of scholars around the world who specialize in Mesoamerican civilization, studies relating to the Olmecs, from archaeologists to historians and beyond, what is the general consensus as to the...
See, and this is the part where, you kind of have to be clear about terminology here. So when he talks about consensus, he's going to talk about, Americanist scholars. They're going to put out the position that, and Deal did this as well. They say that the Americanist position is the mainstream position. Africanists do this when they say, we're specialists in African languages, so we have the consensus view on African languages. Whereas a historical linguist, in both cases, will look at Americanist and Africanist as silly, as, promoting faulty methods, faulty analysis. But when he asks an Americanist, what is the consensus view, he's going to give him the consensus on the Americanist camp. He's not going to go to Africana studies professors in Mexico, which there are. He's not going to go to Africana studies professors in any of the, in any country, anywhere, really, on this issue. And he's certainly not going to ask historical linguists, which is a little bit more nuanced. So the consensus here that he's going to describe specifically is an Americanist consensus.
Origins of the Olmecs.
The overwhelming consensus, and I don't use that term lightly, is that the Olmec are a culture of indigenous descent from the Gulf Coast region of Mexico. There's a body of evidence, including numerous genetic studies, that show that the Olmec are indigenous and not something else. There hasn't been a genetic study that shows ancient African genetic heritage among the indigenous people.
As a disclaimer.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta stop, and I promise I'm not gonna stop it. I'm not gonna stop it too many times. But what he just said is easily proven false. Now, this data didn't really come out when he made this video, but like if I go to, literally their, Harvard Allen Ancient DNA Database, version 9, shows this I 13200 from the Dominican Republic with B. By the way, the position of Sertima, shout out to Yerrick in the building. The position of Sertima is that the Olmecs are indigenous. That's what Ivan van Sertima said. Even in his Smithsonian, reading, and Renoka Rashidi reiterated this numerous times. They believe that the Olmecs were indigenous Americans with influence from Africa, right? So like, this position is not far from the position that the Americanists are specifically relaying here, is not far from African-centered scholars. Most African-centered scholars will say that These are indigenous people who are influenced by Africans. Whereas Americanists, they completely reject the idea that they're influenced by Africans, right? So I just want to reiterate that, that point has to be continuously made.
To my audience, I want to make one thing certain. We are not bashing Afrocentrism. As a whole, I think Afrocentrism is a positive movement in the world of historical studies. If you look up the basic definitions of Afrocentrism, you can see that it is a response to Eurocentrism, which was a variety of narratives that dominated historiography and other sciences. It was a necessary response to make African history matter. I respect African history. Some of the first cultures in human history developed in Africa. Some of the greatest cultures we are just now studying, just now discovering, developed in Africa. Africa has a history that is truly amazing, and to be honest, let's all admit it, it doesn't get the attention it deserves, especially in high schools, at the lower educational levels. And so, I want to make one thing clear. This is not attacking Afrocentrism. People who love African history, who want it to matter as much as European history, there is nothing wrong with that. I applaud you. What we are going to talk about is a minority within Afrocentrism who takes things to the extreme, just like...
Yeah, and this is another thing that we have to talk about because, when he says that he respects Afrocentrism, when he respects African scholarship. And I know I'm going to assume that he didn't mean this. Obviously, he's not here to defend himself. So I'm going to assume that he didn't mean this. But part of Africana studies is African diaspora studies, looking at the global African presence. That's part of African studies. So when he says extreme, this could definitely be interpreted as any Africana studies scholar who goes outside of the so-called sub-Saharan plantation, the Africanist sub-Saharan plantation, right? Like, so if you study black people or black history outside of what Hegel defined as the sub-Saharan boundary, then you become extreme. When we have documented evidence not only of the preeminence of African civilization, but the ways that African people influence other cultures. This is a primary element of African-centered scholarship, Africana scholarship. So it's interesting, like when he says, "Oh, we're going to go after the extreme," he's labeling, there's a group among Afrocentrists who are extreme. Right? Yeah, no, that's a good way. The white man's force field. That's a good way of putting it. The imaginary boundary line of sub-Saharan Africa. So anything beyond that becomes extreme. But I want to hear him, if they do describe what they mean by extreme when they say extreme. What do they mean? There's extreme Afrocentrist. Okay, what do you mean by extreme? What exactly do you mean by that?
There are people who study European history who take things to the extremes. And I'm not going to let a small group reflect negatively on an entire world full of awesome individuals who just love history. And so this video is just here to set the record straight and to allow everyone to get the proper respect they deserve. And that includes the indigenous peoples and cultures of not just ancient America, but those who are with us today. With that being said, I want to now approach the very core topic of this issue, and I want to approach the speculation surrounding the origins of the OLMECs. There is no shortage of theories involving the origins of OLMEC civilization, and even the OLMEC people. Some of these theories were so outlandish, I was surprised I'd never even heard of them before, whether or not it was them being Chinese, Jaredite, or even Nordic. However, I want to take a look at the most dominant theory out there that really pushes back against the mainstream. We see it constantly online, on the news, and even reflected in petitions, and that is the...
There's a reason why it's dominant. It's because it's the consensus view. The consensus view among Africana scholars is that there was some contact in Mesoamerica before Columbus. That's the consensus view among Africana scholars, whereas the Americanists completely reject that notion.
Supposed African origins of OLMEC civilization. And so, Pete, would you walk us through what is this theory?
So before I describe this, I do want to throw out a bit of a disclaimer, which is that there are different versions of this theory that you may hear of. What I'm describing is kind of the original core idea. Now, that being said, this theory actually began...
And we would call it a model. You could say theorem, but we would call it a model. It's a model that has evidence to support it.
In Nubia, which is in the modern-day south of Egypt or northern Sudan. In the 8th century BCE, a Nubian king, Pa, conquered the kingdom of Egypt and declared himself the pharaoh and set up a brand new Nubian dynasty. It's what history refers to as the 25th dynasty. If you want to read up more about it, I highly recommend it. It's a very fascinating period of Egyptian history. But what's key here, for those who may not be aware, is that the Nubians were and still are black Africans. Thus, after Nubian control solidified, so the theory goes, a voyage...
I mean, and again, when he uses that term, black African, he's implying that the Kemites or the Egyptians were not black African. So that's like when we're talking about ancient Africa, we're not talking about anything other than black people, right? That's the first problem I have there, but we're going to continue.
Crewed by Nubians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, set sail around North Africa to West Africa. Now, off the West African coast, the equatorial currents move from east to west, and they can take you from Africa to the American coast. So according to this theory, these sailors rode the current to the Americas and landed in the Mexican Gulf Coast. From there, this group of Nubians, Egyptians made contact with the local people and founded Olmec civilization, kicked it into high gear, and that they were immortalized in Olmec art and culture. The theory tries to trace many features of Mesoamerican culture to ancient African antecedents.
As a great history channel whose focus is clearly in the name, Ancient Americas, I have to ask, when did you first come across this theory in your studies, and what were your initial thoughts?
So I first stumbled upon this when I was doing my own research on the Olmec. When I first read about it, it was within a much broader context of alternate theories. The African theory really isn't that unique. There are many other theories that Chinese, Polynesians, Phoenicians, Vikings, like you mentioned earlier, were the founders of Olmec civilization. Now, among those, the African theory is kind of what's had staying power. But what's really interesting is that these theories basically all work the same way, and that is that they basically latch onto some aspect of Olmec culture, art, or architecture, and they find similarities within another culture. And as long as that culture has, a maritime tradition, they're able to, sail across the ocean at some point in history. Then the theory goes that culture sailed to America and started Olmec civilization. In my own opinion, this is very superficial and circumstantial evidence. It doesn't really carry a lot of weight. It's basically just based on coincidences and similarities that you can find all over the world.
When did this theory first pop up, and when did it really take root among certain French historians and archaeologists?
I'm not actually sure where this theory started precisely. Like I said earlier, many people at one time or another have proposed that Native Americans.
Now, like when he's discounting these things, I want to see if he actually refutes them. Because my assumption is that he's going to give a lot of speculation, and that he's not going to actively refute the claims. That's my assumption. Like, he'll provide alternatives, but nothing will be definitive, basically. So let's see.
Or some lost people of the old world. And I'm sure, somebody far back probably has a theory that, Egyptians colonized the Americas. The first big name that's associated with this is Thor Heyerdahl. For those who don't know who Thor Heyerdahl is, he was a famous, archaeologist and explorer back in the 50s and 60s and 70s who did a lot of reconstructive archaeology, a lot of reconstructive experiments to support, some grand theories that he had. He proposed that Egyptians migrated to the Americas and showed the indigenous people basically how to build pyramids. He even built an Egyptian-style ship and sailed across the Atlantic with it to prove that it was possible and that it could be done.
This civilization known as OLMEC was to cut all other civilizations in America. The Maya, the Toltecs, Aztec, etc. It'll even stretch right out into South America. What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilization, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native Americans and people coming from outside. The most significant of those outsiders were the Africans.
But the theory, as it's more or less presented today, really got started when a African studies scholar named Dr. Ivan.
You notice how, literally, with what he just said, he literally just said that the Native American civilization was contacted by outsiders. I don't know. I'm gonna run that back and let me see if y'all catch that.
And 70s who did a lot of reconstructive archaeology, a lot of reconstructive experiments to support some grand theories that he had. He proposed that Egyptians migrated to the Americas and showed the indigenous people basically how to build pyramids. He even built an Egyptian-style ship and sailed across the Atlantic with it to prove that it was possible and that it could be done.
This civilization
By the way, in the previous video for members only, we went over a live where the Central Intelligence Agency actually referenced Thor Heyerdahl in their analysis, of certain Bolivian groups and their reed papyrus boats. So, what this person would dismiss was actually supported by the Central Intelligence Agency in their training manual, right? So this wasn't really propaganda. This was like a declassified training manual. So, a lot of times, what they're saying is refuted or debunked. They're just saying that as a form of distraction. Right? Now, if I heard correctly, Sardam in this clip, he describes the Olmecs as Native Americans that were influenced by Africans. Let's just listen to it again.
OLMEC was to cut all other civilizations in America. The Maya, the Toltecs, the Aztec, etc. It'll even stretch right out into South America. What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilization, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native Americans and people coming from outside.
I'm gonna slow it down a little bit. I'm gonna slow things down. But he literally just said it contained elements native to America that were also brought from the outside, which according to Sardama, this is Africa. So he's saying the Olmec civilization, which was the mother of American civilizations, had elements native to America. He literally just said that. Let's run it back.
To
normal speed.
To support, some grand theories that he had. He proposed that Egyptians migrated to the Americas and showed the indigenous people basically how to build pyramids. He even built an Egyptian-style ship and sailed across the Atlantic with it to prove that it was possible and that it could be done.
This civilization known as OLMEC was to touch all other civilizations in America. The Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, etc. It was even to stretch right out into South America. What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilization, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native American and people coming from outside.
So he just, I want to make sure that y'all are paying attention. He said it contained elements that were not just native to America, meaning that, you know, there are elements that were native to America, but it also contained elements that were a fusion of Native American elements, as well as elements brought from the outside. So he just said that the Olmec civilization, which is the mother of all American civilizations, was a Native American civilization, Native American fused with Africa, or fused with elements from the outside. Give me a 1 if y'all got that. Give me a 1 if y'all just heard that. If y'all just heard him say that. And I'm gonna continue. But right there off the bat, I could just pause the video and just like not even play anymore, because what he's saying here is not really that controversial. Honestly, it really isn't. You know, well, however I mean, a lot of people, you know, I did a video with bro Reggie, which he disagreed with Ivan Van Sertima. Sure, you know, a lot of people don't like him as a person, but he literally just said that there are Native Americans with Native American elements that were fused with African elements. So I'm gonna continue the video.
The most significant of those outsiders were the Africans.
But the theory...
So he just said the most significant of so Africans were not the only outsiders that contributed to the fusion of Native American elements, but he said that they were the most significant outsiders. That's what he just said. So like anybody claiming that, you know, Sertima or African scholars were trying to steal Olmec civilization when they literally said that the Olmecs were Native Americans predominantly. That's literally what they said, right? And there are some other scholars, Mexican scholars, who would even disagree and probably give them more African ancestry. We're going to get into that as well. But again, this is just like all of this conversation, all of this nonsense that we've been going back and forth. Come to find out that Sertima and African-centered scholars say that these people were Native Americans who had contact with Africans. That is their official position. And that is the position that he presented to the Smithsonian in the 90s. Let's keep it going.
As it's more or less presented today, really got started when a African studies scholar named Dr. Ivan Van Sertima wrote a book in 1976, this book right here. It's been sitting on my bookshelf. In that book, Van Sertima made the case that Africans made pre-Columbian contact with the Americas repeatedly, not just during the Olmec period, but in other periods of African history as well. And his biggest claim in the book, though, was that Olmec civilization was African, and that Africans played a pivotal role within the origin of Mesoamerican culture. In some ways, that book is a product of its time. If you go back to the mid-20th century, diffusionism was all the rage back then. Now, for those that don't know, cultural diffusion is kind of the idea that cultures diffuse and absorb different ideas from each other, and like that is true. Many neighboring cultures do share aspects of culture, art, and technology with each other. Nobody's going to deny that. But back then, diffusionism was seen as a way to explain similarities across very far-flung cultures. So if you saw pyramids on one side of the world and you saw pyramids on the other, certain scholars like Thor Heyerdahl and Dr. Ivan Van Sertima would try to make a case that there was a relationship there, that basically one culture diffused, this architecture, this technology to another civilization. Nowadays, those don't enjoy as much attention as they used to, since then there's been a lot more archaeology, a lot more study that's kind of discredited a lot of those grander theories. And like I said, the book is very much a product of that time when grand theories of diffusion were all the rage. Now, when Van Sertima's book first dropped in 1976, it wasn't taken very seriously by Mesoamerican scholars. It was kind of dismissed. There really wasn't a lot of attention that was given to it.
Yeah. Americanists are not going to take something seriously that overhauls their paradigm. Of course not. The same way that Africanists, up until recently, didn't take historical linguistics seriously. And Americanists don't take historical linguistics or Greenberg's, they use Greenberg's classification of American languages. So they're not going to, even if they're proven wrong, as I'm going to show you, they're not going to ever take it seriously, ever. Because it's against their paradigm, it's against their framework. So we can't expect. Now, some of these Americanists, that we presented do agree with African scholars on this issue. Some of them do, but as a field, like when they're talking about the Americanist consensus, of course they're not going to take it seriously. Of course, they're not even going to look at it unless they want to act as if it, is a joke.
It. As far as I know, no major academic publication ever reviewed it, at least, none that were like Mesoamerican focused. And in hindsight, I think that was a mistake because it really delayed the dialogue between those viewpoints. It's not really until the 90s academia seriously started confronting Dr. Van Sertima's theory, but by then those theories had already found very fertile soil and had put down very deep roots within Afrocentrism. Even today, it's still taught in certain schools, it still gets taught in museums. In a lot of ways, that attention to it kind of came too late. And now I think a lot of academics, a lot of scholars are kind of trying to...
Again, like, and this is kind of... like they're saying, like he loosely uses the word Afrocentrism, and I mentioned this in the beginning of the video. You should have had a scholar, an Africana Studies scholar, who has researched Mesoamerica. There are Africana Studies professors who focus on the African diaspora in Mesoamerica. Some of them possibly agree with and affirm, and others who do not. But the fact is that they're not engaging this conversation with a scholar from the field. They have no idea what is the scholarly consensus among Africana professors, among Africana, analysts. They have no idea, but they don't even take it seriously to even consider, right? So if they don't take us seriously, why exactly should we take them seriously? We really shouldn't.
To play catch up to the gains that it's made.
Let's shift the focus from the proponents of this theory itself and focus on the claims made that supposedly support this theory. And so, let's talk writing systems. Some people have claimed that the Mesoamerican writing systems are related to specific scripts in Africa, and in some cases, even in Europe. And so, what do you have to say that counters this?
You'll find a lot of claims where people will point out that there are similarities between, for example, Egyptian hieroglyphs and later Maya hieroglyphs as well, and that both of those scripts are both logosyllabic scripts. The truth is that logosyllabic scripts are not uncommon in the world. They certainly pop up in a lot of places, and when you have scripts like that, they have a lot of characters. They'll often have hundreds of characters, sometimes even thousands. When you have that many characters, you're bound to find similarities, you're bound to find coincidences. And I think in a lot of those cases, that's what's going on. Now, the earliest example of OLMEC writing is the Cascahel block, which was only discovered in the last 20 years in the OLMEC heartland, and it contains a previously unknown script. Now, I should say there is some debate as to whether that's actual writing, but the general consensus among Mesoamerican scholars is that it is a writing script. I'm personally a bit skeptical of this, but if it is writing, it's very old. It definitely predates the theorized African contact, and shows that Olmec writing was an independent invention. It wasn't borrowed by anyone else. And realistically, a lot of times when you have writing in stone, there's typically lots of other writing on perishable materials, like wood, bark, paper, that just doesn't survive. And it may be the case there.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be straw men throughout, because on one, he's saying that, like, they're acting as if, Sertima was a culture historical archaeologist, like straight up diffusionist, that his argument is that every aspect of Olmec civilization came from Africans, which even in the clip, he didn't even say that. He didn't even say that in the clip. And then with respect to writing, first of all, the argument isn't really about whether or not the Olmec writing system itself was created by Africans. Now, there are certain people like Clyde Winters who claim that it was, or claim that it was at least derived from like Mande related people. However, if you look at the scholarship, what you'll see is certain letters and certain orthographic commonalities, right? And that's borrowing. Like, scripts borrow letters all the time. There are scholars who even believe that Tifinagh borrowed some letters from Phoenician, which would be one of its relative scripts. So the general argument among Africana scholars would be borrowing.
There, that very little of a large corpus has survived. Again, that's just speculation, though.
I want to shift focus now and talk about a subject that is quite controversial.
And again, he mentioned the hieroglyphs, because, which I'm actually happy about this. I'm happy that he didn't do the standard, limiting it to Abubakari, which is what a lot of neophytes do, honestly. They try to limit they try to limit the contact model, the Africa to Mesoamerica contact model, to Abubakari, as if the argument is that Abubakari, sold ships to the Americas and created the Olmec civilization, which is, again, it shows you that, most detractors have not read Ivan Van Sertima at all. Even in African presence in early America, he literally had a starting point at 50,000 BC. So like the idea of, oh, the chronology doesn't, I mean, it's just it's a really lazy, you know, because even if that was emphasized in the text, which, you know, some people believe that it was, or that's what got the most press. But honestly, like, I would deny that claim, because Sertima was not who popularized Batsamande Bori or Abubakari II. He was already known within Africana studies and Africana scholarship. But because that was the more popularized version, people are like, oh, Sertima was wrong because Abubakari is in the 14th century and the Olmecs are the 13th century BCE. The chronology doesn't matter. And it gets into this really lazy argumentation, which, you know, I'm glad that he's starting it from the 25th dynasty, which is an improvement on the typical arguments, but I can tell that he's getting this from Hazeb Vieira, Montiano, and Barber. I can tell that he's getting his arguments from that Current Anthropology 1997 forum, because if you actually read the text, they actually go way, way, way back. Like, the contact is way, way, way back. So, with respect to writing, he mentioned the hieroglyphs, but if you look at, you know, David Kelly, who spoke about the Tifinagh writing system, you can see some orthographic commonalities between certain letters seen on the Lomahara stele, as well as certain letters in Mandinka and Tifinagh. So right here you see some Tifinagh, you see some Mandinka writing system, or Rampa writing systems that were also used among the Fulani pastoralists. You know, pretty ubiquitous through West Africa. Many scholars like Delafosse view this writing system seen in Oued Mortutek in Algeria, as well as on, you know, Saharan drawings by the Dogon and the Bambara people. They theorize that the Rampa would be an ancestor of Vai, Mende, and other Mandinka writing systems, right? But if you look here, you can see clear commonalities between just the way that they represented these different scripts and glyphs, right? So that's a clear case. And this would align with the patterns of aerial diffusion between the languages. And you also have these Mende scripts, you know, pretty ubiquitous throughout Africana scholarship, is the idea of Mente or Mende scripts in Monte Alban or the Zapotec hieroglyphs. And again, you know, these similarities could be due to chance, you know, which a lot of these Americanists would say that it's chance. But also, you know, if we have evidence of the Mende people or Mande people navigating across the Atlantic, which we definitely do, it's possible that these could have been borrowings, especially if we're dealing with like 3000, 4000 BC, you know, 4th millennia BC type of time span. You know, these proto groups, it is a possibility, especially if we consider the fact that many of the modern, you know, Mande people actually navigated south. You know, so prior to their navigation south, they could have been attracted to waterways that drifted them into the sea and then into the Atlantic Ocean across the waters. So it's definitely plausible. And we see clear evidence that aligns with numerous scholars who have articulated, you know, African writing systems in America. Rashidi, Onuegbu, Winners, Van Sertima, Wangara, Moncayo, Gaines, Kamugisha, etc. So let's keep going on.
Osteology and its role in archaeology. Claims have been made that there is osteological evidence that the Olmecs were of African origin. And so I have to ask, what are the problems surrounding this claim?
That's a very good question. For those who don't know, osteology is basically just refers to the studies of bones, skeletons, and in this field, scientists basically will, you know, measure the shape and the features of skulls and compare them with other populations to try to determine what race, what ethnicity that skeleton is. Claims have been made that there are African skeletons in North and South America that predate Columbian contact. Now, those claims sound a lot grander than they actually are, and you need to take them with a big grain of salt. So back in the day, in the 20th century, especially the early 20th century, I mean, these skeletal measurements were all the rage, and Van Sertima loves to bring them up in his book that lots of Negroid skeletons have been found in South America and North America. But experts are a lot more cautious now about classifying a skeleton as a specific race. If you ever see forensic scientists analyze a skeleton nowadays, they're never going to say like this is a Caucasian skeleton, this is a Asian skeleton. Instead, they're going to say this skeleton is statistically similar to skeletons of this race or ethnicity or what have you. They're much more aware that that those comparisons only go so far and that exceptions are common. If you want an example of this where this has kind of gone awry, I would suggest looking up the Kennewick Man. Just as some background, Kennewick Man is a famous skeleton that was discovered in Washington back in the 90s. It's 8,000 or 9,000 years old. It's one of the oldest skeletons that we have of someone in the Americas. And when scientists first analyzed the bones of Kennewick Man and they measured up his skull, did a facial reconstruction, he had several Caucasian features, and predictably this caused a lot of controversy. And a lot of white supremacists, white nationalists really took this and ran with it, that there were white people in the Americas and that they built mounds and did all this cool stuff. I mean, really nasty stuff. Now eventually permission was granted to do genetic studies on those bones. Well, I shouldn't say permission was granted. The scientists won the right in court to do genetic studies on the bones, and that's like a whole other topic. But what those genetic tests showed was that this man, who had several Caucasian features, was undoubtedly Native American. I mean, the genetics just showed without a doubt he was an indigenous male. And it kind of showcases the limits of what skeletal reconstructions can tell us. Skeletons, like skin color, physical traits, they change over time. When we make these comparisons, we're making them with modern populations. We don't have this database of skeletons from antiquity that we positively know their race and can build this huge database of. So, like I said before, those studies are very problematic. They also have a very racist history. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you'd have a lot of white scientists go into the Americas, go into Africa, dig up bodies, measure the bones, and declare, oh, these people were Caucasian and they were civilized and great, and dig up other bodies and say, oh, these were African or these were Indian and they were barbaric savages who didn't do anything. So these kind of studies have a checkered history, and I don't want to imply that there isn't a utility to them, but we just have to be cautious about how we interpret them.
And now I want to talk about.
So I mean, to me, that was a clear cop out. Give me a 1 in the chat if you caught that. Give me a 1 in the chat if you caught what he just said. And I'm gonna break it down. If you saw the cop out or the copium, give me a 1 if you saw that. Yeah, Kira. Mansa, I'm not sure if Mansa made that claim. I'd have to check the sources. I'm not sure if he made that claim. Yeah, tell me what it is if you got it, Kira. What's the cope? What's the cope in the statement that he just made? Let me know in the chat. You can see a lot of 1s. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the fact that he knows that many of the remains that have been found are clearly African. Like there's certain things like the zygomatic bone, there's certain measurements. The King's Monologue channel is really good at this. Dolichocephalism, the nasal aperture. Like there's certain things that are definitive in terms of, African remains. And this isn't just a one-off. This isn't a one-off. Like Kennewick Man is a one-off. If we found, a large preponderance of skulls that had, that categorization of so-called Caucasoid, then maybe. But again, yeah, exactly. Don't make it about race, Mike. Africans are the most diverse people in the world. All types of skull shapes and skull morphology is seen among Africans, among the African community. All types is seen among African people. So having a facial physiognomy that could be more similar to Europeans is not uncommon on the African continent. And it also wouldn't be common in more diverse populations, right? And this is where, Africana Studies has the advantage in speaking of the African origin of Homo sapiens sapiens, right? So when faced with this individual, he's saying that, yeah, there is definitely a lot of African skulls, so-called Negroid, what we would classify as an obvious, quote-unquote, sub-Saharan African. That is ubiquitous throughout, Mesoamerican remains. But how they get out of it is they say, oh, it was probably a Melanesian. It was probably a Black Asiatic, Negrito. It was something other than an African. And we just haven't figured out yet. But it was something other than an African. These skulls that are predominantly, yeah, they'll do anything to avoid giving credit to black people. Now, this post on the right is what I have from Guadarrama. and Guadarrama gave a non-metric train analysis of, Wyszynski, and he found biological heterogeneity at Tlatelolco. I see that right. Tlatelolco. So Vargas identified two morphological groups. So he found two groups. He found a gracile tipo habitual with short faces, quadrangular orbits, and non-projective zygomatics. According to, King's monologue, he stated that this was stereotypically like a East Asian person, right? And then there was a robust type with elongated faces, rounded orbits, prominent supraorbital ridges, and anteriorly projecting zygomatic bones, high cheekbones, right? And, there's a divergence. So 40% of the Tlatelolco remains were of the different type, right? So the different type seen by Vargas Guadarrama aligns very closely with the equatorial and Dongolan type of Wyszynski. So again, we have clear evidence in Mesoamerica of bones remains that we would classify as black because they fall within the range. Even if you use Seligman's true Negro hypothesis, they fall in that range. It's just that the Americanists are more comfortable with saying that they came from Asia or the Pacific Islands than saying that they came from Africa. But this has definitively been proven. Yeah, he avoids actual measurements by trying to say that Van Sertima did something wrong by using the measurements. Which, again, they still use this today. They still use this stuff today. He's saying it's problematic from an ethical perspective, but objectively, if the skeletal remains align with black populations, then we're supposed to assume that they weren't black, according to these Americana scholars. Cressy says the only thing that question about Kings is entertaining foundational black Brits. Yeah, I mean, I think I came across that video. I haven't really watched it. But yeah, if he's talking about the Cheddar Man or whatever, I think that's something that's been admitted. So if he's referring to Cheddar Man when he's talking about that, I don't think that's too controversial. I mean, most Mesolithic Europeans were dark skinned because they didn't really have the gene for light skin or lactose intolerance. Like Lebrana man in Spain 7,000 years ago was light skinned or was dark skinned and could not digest milk. So, if he's going from a Euro-African perspective, but a lot of the FBB is from Clyde Winters. Clyde Winters is behind that stuff. So, yeah, I haven't really gotten deep into that, to be honest. But I can see certain ways where you could affirm, black populations in the UK. Shout out to everybody in the building. If I reach my goal, by the end of this show, I'm going to give you guys some secret research. If I don't, it's only going to be for Patreon. What is the research? The research is that I have a scholar from Mexico, a Spanish-speaking scholar. I just started the goal. And this scholar is not an Afrocentrist. This scholar is a Mexican, and he has done some independent analysis showing that the Olmecs were indeed heavily influenced by Africans, and he breaks that down very, very well. So 10 super chats, 5 or more, or enough people hitting the Cash App. If I got at least 5 people hitting the Cash App, then I'm gonna share the research from the scholar. I'm not gonna use the scholar's name because if I use a name, you'll be able to find it, the research. But yeah, it's some pretty good stuff. And honestly, this scholar presented pretty compelling archaeological evidence. Shout out to Kira Grant, support our people. Appreciate that. This scholar, if you take their evidence and you put it together, they completely blow the Viking argument out of the water. So if we do accept the Viking stuff, I mean, this scholar gives archaeological evidence. He gives indigenous oral history. He gives indigenous scholars who wrote about this. So like, this stuff is pretty clear. I think with this Mexican scholar's work, it pretty much ends this debate about the Olmecs having African influence. Like, it definitively ends the debate. So if you want to see that, you know, do what Kieran did. Shout out to Kieran. Show some support to this channel, and we will have that available for y'all. Yeah, FBB or FBB. I think that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know about the political aspect of that. That seems kind of bizarre to me, to be honest. But let's continue.
About a subject that everyone loves. From one side of the world to the other, there is no shortage of studies, history books, fringe television shows that focus on pyramids. And so I want to ask, when it comes to pyramids and the supposed OLMEC African link, how do pyramids play a role here?
Yeah, pyramids are another thing that gets brought up in these theories. Now, the Nubians were pyramid builders just like their Egyptian neighbors. Actually, it's interesting. Egypt had stopped building pyramids almost 1,000 years before that, but the Nubians kept that tradition going. They were still chugging and building pyramids, you know, when they annexed Egypt. And if you check out the city of Meroe along the Nile, those pyramids are still there. You can see them. They look awesome. And as the theory goes, these Nubians and Egyptians, showed the people of Mesoamerica how to build a pyramid. But there's some things that are wrong with this theory. First of all, pyramids are not unique to Egypt. They're not unique to Nubia. They're not unique to Mesoamerica. You can find pyramids all over the world, and there's a very good reason for that. The pyramid is the most simple and sturdy design that you can use to build a tall structure. I mean, any kid who builds with wooden blocks is going to figure out that if you want to build something high, you build a big base and slowly work your way up. What's actually even more interesting is that pyramids and platform mounds like that were actually being built in the Americas for thousands of years before the Olmec were doing them. In fact, if you go to South America, you can find pyramids there that were being built at the same time that the pyramids of Egypt were being built. And again, to take Dr. Van Sertima's logic and kind of run with this, if you kind of want to adopt that diffusionist logic, it makes more sense to attribute the pyramids in Mesoamerica to pyramids that were being built in North America or South America. And I'm not saying that that's what happened. I'm just saying that's kind of the logical consequence of it. But there's even more than that. Another problem with that argument is that Egyptian and Nubian pyramids are very different from Mesoamerican pyramids. Egyptians and Nubians built their pyramids out of cut stone that they stacked in the shape of a pyramid, and usually those pyramids served a mortuary function. They were typically tombs for kings and pharaohs. Pyramids in Mesoamerica were not built as tombs. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, that was not their primary function. Instead, you would have a pyramid with a platform and then a structure built on top, some sort of temple or elite residence or council house, something like that. And these pyramids aren't built of stone. In the Americas, you see pyramids that are kind of built up of earth mostly, and then sometimes they'll be like effaced with stone. So even when you see a pyramid that looks like it's built of stone in the Americas, usually it's an earthen pyramid that's just covered in stone.
Yeah, I mean, he's not really, and this isn't his field, but he's not really refuting it as much as he is giving alternatives. So he's not really like at best he's maybe saying that some of these other things are more plausible, but he's not actually refuting it. And this is kind of a theme. He doesn't really refute it directly. He just says, oh, this is another possibility, right?
So on the surface, it may look like you're comparing apples to apples when you look at pyramids. We're really comparing apples to oranges. These are very different structures for very different purposes. The only thing they have in common, is the shape, and that's it.
When it comes to the theory that the Olmecs were African, that Olmec civilization derived from an African origin, I tend to see that advocates of these theories really focus on the colossal heads. They look at the distinct facial features of these giant works of art, and especially the facial structure and the nose, to prove their point. But I have to ask, where do they go wrong here?
So when people look at the Olmec heads, the first thing they notice, like you said, are those pronounced facial features, specifically the wide noses and full lips. And this is really kind of the heart of the theory for most people. The idea is that these people look like, these Olmec sculptures look like West Africans, and indeed they do have similar features, but we need to remember that Africans are not the only people who have these features.
And then I have to stop him just to contextualize. Just the fact that he's not dealing with scholars. He's not dealing with contemporary scholars who have written about this. He's treating laymen and scholars as if they're one hodgepodge. Right? Because if you look at the scholarship, the heads are actually not the main point. But let's continue.
And it's interesting because this is something I didn't really realize until I started reading the comments on my own Olmec video, and noticed that lots of people pointed out that they look, that they look indigenous, that they look, Latino, but that they also look, like Polynesians, Southeast Asians, as well as Africans as well. And what I quickly realized is that when we look at the Olmec, what we see in them says more about us than it says about the Olmec themselves. When we look at those features, our brain kind of just reaches for the nearest lookalike. And if you grew up in the United States, for example, the closest lookalike is probably an African American or somebody of African descent. The fact is, if you go to Veracruz and you look at the indigenous people there, many of them have those same features. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. there's actually a scientific reason for this. The shape of the nose is primarily a function of climatic factors, such as like, the heat, the humidity of the environment that you're in. One of the functions of the nose is to moisten the air before it goes into the lungs. So if you're in an area that's very dry, such as like deserts, your nose will be longer and thinner so that it can moisten that air a lot better. If you live in like a tropical, humid environment, it'll tend to be shorter and wider because your body doesn't need as much help to moisten that air as you inhale. And so that's why we see these features in so many areas, is that it's an adaptation to the environment. I mean, like I said earlier, physical traits, phenotype, these change over time, as a result of the environment, as a result of mixing with other populations. And so it really shouldn't be a surprise that the faces look like that. Oh, and one last thing I'll call attention to, this is something that I see brought up a lot, is people will point out that the OLMEC heads have braids on the back of their head. In fact, there's only one OLMEC head that has braids on the back, and that's OLMEC head 2 at the site of Tres Zapotes. Now, many people who endorse this theory will assert that those are cornrows or African braids or like Ethiopian hairstyles. I've seen that brought up as well. Again, this is just speculation. I mean, it's completely possible that the OLMEC wore their hair like that as well. I've also seen some people speculate that it's not even braids; it's part of a feather head.
I mean, he's responding to speculation with speculation, right? And by the way, and we made this point before, modern scholars say that the mestizo Mexicans have African ancestry. So how do we know that these indigenous people and these mestizos didn't get those features from their African ancestors? You can't definitively say that they didn't. If it's been proven genetically that they descend from Africans, at least a few hundred years ago, you can't definitively prove that they didn't.
Address, the idea that these have to be African, that they can only be African, that's just speculation. They could just as easily be indigenous. Now, the biggest issue with this argument that the OLMEC heads are African is that Dr. Van Sertima's dates, as he put forth in his work, don't actually match the dates of the heads. Now, back when his book was written, dating technology was not as sophisticated as it was. There wasn't as much material to carbon date. There just wasn't as large a body of evidence. Today, we have carbon dating that is much better calibrated. We have more carbon dating samples, and we know now with certainty that those heads were actually carved several centuries before the 25th dynasty of Egypt, before that supposed expedition from Egypt to West Africa into the
Again,
Americas.
this is just he keeps, he does a better job, to be honest. Like he doesn't limit it to Abubakari 14th century. So instead of like a kindergarten argument, he gives like a 7th grade argument with limiting the contact model to the 25th dynasty specifically, which is that's not what Sertima said within his work. Now we have a scholar by the name of David Kelly, prominent scholar, and he basically, when he looked at the philtra or philtrum on OLMEC statues and the cornrows, he determined that this was indicative of African ancestry as opposed to Melanesian ancestry, right? So this is a trained archaeologist and expert epigrapher, who said that the physiognomy and the braiding in the OLMECs, about the OLMECs, literally, was indicative of African ancestry, right? Now, when we go to Monument F is like clear dolichocephalicism, clear, longer lower face profile. There's no indigenous person that looks like this unless they were heavily mixed with Africans. Like, no indigenous person has these features. No indigenous Americans. Only those who are heavily mixed with Africans, right? So let's just keep it going.
Well, to be fair, Dr. Van Sertima, did acknowledge those revised dates, and he actually revised his theory in the 90s and, just pushed those dates back, a couple centuries, and, kind of explained it away as, there was always an African presence in Egypt, and clearly that could have set sail earlier, and that kind of revision to me is a bit telling. If your theory is that flexible that you can just, arbitrarily kind of push your dates back and forth, is it even that strong of a theory to begin with? When you have a theory, the more evidence that is discovered, the more research that is done, the more data that's collected, it's either going to bear out that theory or it's not. And
I don't think that's how science works, really. I mean, theories are corrected all the time. The theory of relativity, the theory of gravity, these theories have addendums all the time. So him saying that, chronological dating won't change aspects of a theory, I don't think any theory has ever, been able to withstand that type of scrutiny. I don't know it. I mean, if y'all know some in the chat, feel free to let me know. But if you're having a theory about contact and you give such a wide span, the dating or not of a particular remain isn't going to change the spectrum of time that you're analyzing. So that was a really weak point, in my opinion.
in this case, all this, all the discoveries we've made since then don't bear out the theory. But even more than that, latching on to these heads as, proof of an African origin ignores the fact that, that the Olmec sites that those heads come from, like San Lorenzo, La Venta, were occupied for centuries before the first head was even carved. And during that time before, you can see a local development, a progression of Olmec culture in the archaeological record. You can kind of see that culture.
And the problem, he's literally promoting diffusionism, like, without even promoting it. Because I'm gonna name the scholar's name, but those people that he's referring to were not the same as the Olmecs. They were a completely different people than the Olmecs. Like, assuming that all of these people are the same is flawed.
Culture fermenting and developing. It's not like these heads come out of nowhere. There's a progression that's at work, and it's an indigenous progression, not something that's coming out of left field.
I want to talk about other arguments, lesser arguments, theories that may not get as much attention when it comes to the supposed African origins of Olmec civilization. Could you walk us through what some of these lesser arguments are?
Yeah, so there are definitely other arguments that are not as popular as what we've been discussing, but they do come up from time to time, and they're very worth addressing. One that you see come up is centers around mummification. In the Americas, specifically in South America, you find mummification is practiced, was practiced a lot there in pre-Columbian times, and the argument is basically that Egyptians brought this across the Atlantic and showed people how to make a mummy. The problem with that argument is that actually mummification in South America in particular is much older than mummification is in Egypt. The Chinchorro mummies, which are the earliest mummies that you find in South America, they predate the earliest Egyptian mummies by 2,000 years. This isn't even close. People in South America were mummifying their dead long before anyone in Egypt was doing it. I've also seen people point out that the tomb of Pakal,
Libyan mummy is like 7,000 years ago. So again, it's just funny the way that they limit African chronology while trying to expand American chronology to make their point. I don't think they were doing it on purpose. I just think it was a really lazy... they could have been doing it on purpose. But ultimately, I just think it was really lazy of them.
the Great in the city of Palenque, or use the indigenous name Wakama, is mummified like an Egyptian. He has a stone sarcophagus like an Egyptian. The problem with that argument is that Pakal was never mummified. He was just laid to rest in a sarcophagus. If you look at a picture of his body, it's just bones, it's not wrapped or embalmed or anything. So that's an incorrect argument as well. And while we're on the subject of mummies, this is something that comes up as well. A lot of people will speak about cocaine mummies, and what that theory. The way that argument goes is that back in the 70s or 80s, I forget exactly when, there was a mummy that was analyzed by scientists that was found to have cocaine and nicotine on it in its tissue. And so, the conclusion goes that cocaine and nicotine, come from coca and tobacco. Those aren't old world plants; they're new world plants. They're only native to the Americas. Therefore, somebody must have gone over the Americas, gotten some tobacco and coca, and brought it back to Egypt, where presumably a pharaoh threw a great party, and then lived out a good life, died, and the traces are there and prove it. If you actually go and look at the study of that, that conclusion is very problematic because, for one thing, it's only been found on one mummy. This isn't a pattern that we see across several mummies. It's just one. So already that's a red flag. It's an anomaly. Second, the history of that mummy is problematic because that mummy was taken out of Egypt, I think in like 1910s. It was brought into a private collection, not like a museum or anything, a private collection where it stayed there for decades. And it wasn't removed from that collection and analyzed, until the 70s or 80s. It was there for decades. During that time, what most likely happened is that it got contaminated with cocaine and nicotine. And you got to remember, back in the 20s, like cocaine is very easy to get. It's probably the days that they're still putting it in Coca-Cola. Smoking was very big back then as well. It's really not a stretch of the imagination to say that mummy was probably contaminated with those materials. If this was a mummy that was found in a solid archaeological context and analyzed right away.
Yeah, and this is something that we've discussed on the channel ad nauseum, that, when it comes to the analysis of these mummies, right, the study by Balabanova and Jet confirmed the presence of these remains in these specific mummies, right, without contamination. So there was some cultivation. And according to the scholars Sorensen and Johansson of the Sino-Platonic papers, there was a transfer from South America to Kemet, by the 2nd millennia BC. And this validates ancient voyaging, right? And this is the case for cocaine or coca and tobacco. You have tobacco in India, not Carney and Ashraf. So you have it even in India, right? And Bruchel, defended this rigorously against contamination. Wells and Jet. So scholars have refuted the contamination claim. Excuse me. Right? Scholars have refuted these contamination claims. So him saying that this is just contamination, that's been debunked, by these published findings. And what I find interesting is that he's kind of flowing off the top of the head. He's not really referencing anything. he's responding to speculation with his own alternative speculation. So he's not really proving much other than, trying to discount the African method. Right? They always have an excuse. You know what I'm saying?
In a way, that'd be something different. That's not what we're dealing with here. Another argument that often comes up a lot online, and actually this is I'll be totally transparent. This is actually the argument that intrigues me the most, and that's the presence of old world crops in the new world. And actually, Dr. Van Sertima brings up a lot of these arguments as well. Basically, he points out that there are certain crops that have been that are in the Americas that originally come from Africa or some other part of the old world. Like a good example is the bottle gourd, or as some people call it, the calabash. That plant is originally native to Africa. And the bottle gourd is a very useful fruit because you can use it as a container once it dries out. You can use it as a food source as well. So it's very commonly used in Africa. It ends up in pre-Columbian America. It's used a lot there as well. And the problem with that theory, though, is that gourds are known to be very water resistant. You can literally have a gourd floating in water for over a year, and if it washes up on shore, those seeds will still germinate. People have done experiments with that and shown that it's possible. So most likely, some gourds, washed out to sea, washed out on the shores of the Americas, and just took off from there. Another element of this theory that you sometimes come up with is cotton.
So again, what I'm saying, like, they always want to say that it was natural. So like the plants, monkeys, rats, they were able to cross the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas, but African humans were not, right? So again, you literally see this, and I'm going to read this post. According to Sørensen Johansen, the bottle gourd originated in Africa. It appears early in America, as documented by Bird, Whitaker, Brucher, and Heiser. Its simultaneous presence in 5th Dynasty Kemetic tombs and India necessitates a transoceanic transfer. Lathrop and Schwerin hypothesized natural drift from Africa. Even Ivan van Sertima postulated this, which is interesting how they don't mention that. Sertima, he considered it natural as a possibility. Patino, Mangelsdorf, et al., and Brucher reject this due to the absence in the Antilles in eastern South America. So if it was naturally drifted from Africa, why exactly is it not present naturally in the eastern portion of South America, like eastern Brazil? Why is it not present in the Caribbean islands? Right? It's not present at these times, but it is present early in the Pacific coast. Right? So then when you look at the experiments on the oceanic viability from Tao, Carter, Whitaker, and Carter, they were inconclusive. And then Camp noted establishment issues. Whistler's finding that it was absent in Western Polynesia, but present in Eastern Polynesia, further undermines drift, leading him to conclude that it was introduced to Eastern Polynesia from South America by voyagers. The consensus on this issue is that human agency, not natural drift, best explains the pre-Columbian presence of the calabash or bottle gourd in both hemispheres. So again, this scholar is actually, speculating and, right, he's speculating, and he's not actually engaging with the research on the issue. He's just kind of shooting from the hip, which is cool, but the consensus on this issue from scholars who have looked at it is saying transoceanic transfer is how the calabash got from Africa to the Americas, right? And he's going to get into cotton. Let's see what he says about cotton.
I'm not going to go into the biology of this because I'll admit I'm not a biology major or anything, but basically there's genetic evidence that some of the cotton that's native to North America is at some point was crossbred with cotton from Africa, that those species hybridized. Okay, now people like Dr. Van Sertima will argue that this is evidence that not just hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, like 4,000 years ago, that people from West Africa were making their way to the Americas. They took cotton with them, and it got mixed up with cotton that was native to the Americas. Now the dates for cotton in Mesoamerica go back very far. They go back to 3,500 BCE, which is way before the 4,000 years ago date. That'd be 2000 BC. It goes way before his dates, and that 3,500 BCE date is a date for fully domesticated cotton, which not like semi-domesticated or wild. It's fully domesticated by that point, so it's probably even further back than that when that cotton is first getting used. And then secondly, it's still possible for cotton to make a crossing like the bottle gourd across the ocean. Now cotton seeds are not like gourds. If you soak those in water for an extended period of time, they won't germinate. They'll basically get waterlogged and be useless. However, that being said, it's possible that they could have washed out on some natural raft as part of a large tree or something. It's also possible that animals can carry them. Specifically, like birds, they'll eat the seeds, migrate, and then after they've digested the seeds, deposit them on the ground somewhere. And studies have shown that that those seeds in those cases are able to germinate. What's What's also really interesting as well is that, that cotton type as well, that species of cotton is also found in Hawaii before any humans are even there. So a lot of people point out, well, if that can get all the way to Hawaii, just naturally, no humans are there before that point. It surely could have gotten across the Atlantic. It's, a much bigger target at a shorter distance, basically. So again, those arguments have their limits. I mean, it certainly is possible, like I said, that, some African sailor, either deliberately or unintentionally sailed to the Americas, washed up on shore, and left those crops there for people to use. There's just no way to prove it, though. No evidence of that has ever been found. Interestingly, when Van Sertima brings up these arguments in his book, a lot of the scholars and scientists that he cites in those sections have gone on the record since then to basically say, we don't believe that, this movement of, plants from the old world to the new world is, a product of mankind. We believe that it's a natural process. So a lot of those arguments are also deceiving in that regard as well. And while we're on the subject of Dr. Van Sertima, one last thing that I'll mention that he and some other scholars do is that the sources they use are overwhelmingly European. Very few of them are indigenous.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's funny coming from an Americanist who, they are antagonistic to indigenous scholarship. So like an Americanist saying that he's not using indigenous sources, I think is pretty rich. But on the topic of cotton, here, I think I still got y'all. He goes, let's just read this right here. So according to Sorensen and Johannesson, tetraploid cotton, Gossypium barbadens and Gossypium hirsutum, originated in the Americas. And you have a hybridization from a New World D genome diploid and an A genome Old World diploid, right? So you see Gossypium arboreum, from India and Asia. Or hold on, that's the A genome diploid, right? So when it comes to this hybridization, scholars like Sillow, Stevens, Brucher, Hutchinson, and Vendel argue required human agency as natural seed drift is implausible, right? The subsequent pre-Columbian dispersal of these American cottons affirm voyaging. So you have Gossypium barbadens, went from South America to Polynesia, and it had a Sanskrit name noted in India. Then you have Gossypium hirsutum, and it moved from Mexico to West Africa and the Cape Verde Islands pre-1966. Right, and then you have Gossypium tomentosum in Hawaii, introduced from the Americas, and Gossypium gossypoides in Mexico, shows African genetic sequencing indicating ancient contact, according to Wendell, Schnabel, Seelinen, Foster, and Shu. Then you have other species, Braziliensis, Danarioids, Religiosum, etc. So again, according to the research on cotton, it shows that human voyaging played a pivotal role in cotton transfer.
He likes to quote a lot of contact period accounts where certain indigenous people are described as black. Now, as I described earlier, like physical traits, phenotype, I mean, they're not limited to just one specific people. Many people can have dark skin. I mean, you look at, Polynesians, Aboriginals in Australia, people in India, they can have very...
So again, I want y'all to pay close attention to this. When he's saying, Ivan Van Sertima relies on European sources, he's trying to discount the large number of sources that Ivan Van Sertima cited where European explorers stated that they found black people, African people, in the Americas. So what he's going to imply is that these Europeans didn't know what black people looked like. They couldn't tell the difference between a dark-skinned Native American and a dark-skinned African. That's what he's going to imply. Now, does he cite any specific evidence for that? No. Is that possible? Yeah, it's possible that they were ignorant and they classified all dark people as Africans. That's possible. But this is his way of skirting the fact that Van Sertima correctly, and many other African scholars correctly cited, men like Columbus, Balboa, etc. Early European explorers in their own writings said that they found black people in the Americas before, the voyaging of Columbus. And even after Balboa in 1513, he found a settlement of black folks in Darien, what is now Panama, I believe in the Pacific coast. So he found, Mesoamerican black folk in the early 16th century, right? So he's trying to discount these findings. Now, he doesn't mention them specifically, but his way of discounting them is that these white people didn't know what black people look like, and they couldn't tell the difference between these black folks.
Very, very dark skin. And there are Native Americans also that also have very, very dark skin. And so, when these conquistadors or explorers, arrive in the Americas and they see dark-skinned indigenous people, they just describe them, as black or, Negro, as a shorthand, not as some kind of like scientific or anthropological designation. They're just describing them the way that they're, used to describing people of dark skin. It's also worth mentioning these people were not ethnographers. They were often, gallivanting around the Americas looking for plunder, looking for ways to get rich quick. It's safe to say that they didn't always completely understand what they were seeing or what they were hearing. And so that negatively impacts the use of those accounts. So when people bring up those descriptions, take them with a big grain of salt. Just because somebody in the Americas has very dark skin does not inherently mean that they're African. It just means.
And I brought this up on my X. I exposed how Africanists literally help FBA and the Abos and the Pretendians, but these people are too foolish to realize it, because these Africanists say that whenever they see black people in the Americas, they're not African. They're comfortable with them being Melanesian or an Asiatic black man, Pacific Islander, but they don't want to admit that these are Africans. So he's literally doing the same thing right here. He's saying that, when these Europeans defined black people or Negroes in ancient America based upon their own descriptions, those were not Africans. He literally just said that. So again, these Americanist, mainstream Americanist scholars literally promote FBA, Abo, Pretendian, by denying that early European explorers who classified black and Negro people in the early Americas actually saw people from the African continent. He's literally just, promoting that. So I think that's hella funny. Just as much as like Van Sertima gets accused of being an Abo and a Pretendian, when he said that black people are not indigenous to the Americas, he said that the OLMECs and many other subsequent civilizations were indigenous African civilizations. He's saying that there was contact, in between Africa and the Americas. But then the Americanists come and say, yeah, there were some so-called black or blacker looking people, but they weren't African. They were Melanesians and Pacific Islanders. You know what I'm saying? These people, these white guys, they didn't know what black people look like, right? So I thought that was pretty funny.
They have dark skin. And what's actually interesting is that skin color, the color of your skin does not automatically mean that there's this close genetic connection. Oftentimes people with the same skin color can have very different genetics, and people with very different skin color can have very close genetic ties. Like a good example of this that I recently learned about is that the Circassian people of the Caucasus, the Caucasus where we get the word Caucasian from, the Circassian people there are, have very fair complexions, very light skin, blonde hair appears, blue eyes appear, they look very European, for lack of a better term. What's really interesting is that they're not actually closely related to Europeans. They're more closely related to people of the Middle East. Like a Circassian person has more genetically in common with an Arab than they do with a Scotsman, for example. And that's an example where, when we compare those people visually, we would expect, the Scotsman and the Circassian to be very similar, when in fact they are not. And interestingly enough, if you look at the genetics of sub-Saharan Africa, those are the most diverse genetics in the world. Even though nearly everybody living there has the same skin color, they're incredibly diverse genetically. It's not what you would expect at first glance, but that is in fact the case.
When it comes to this subject, this theory, would you agree and say that not only is there an outdated narrative being pushed here, but to be quite frankly, one that's very toxic?
I would say that this is an outdated and harmful narrative that dispossesses the indigenous people of their heritage. Now, I don't want to imply that everyone...
How is it outdated if it's still being published by contemporary African scholars? If updated research, like Gaines et al.'s research at the conference, updated research is still being presented on this topic. How is it outdated? How is it outdated if there's contemporary research? You could say that you disagree with the model, but the model is still living. The model is still being enhanced with more evidence. So that's not outdated. Now toxic, let's just allow him to continue.
One pushing this narrative is part of some sinister racist agenda. I'm sure many people are just repeating what they've learned without realizing its faults. That said, there certainly are toxic Afrocentrists who do try to claim that Mesoamerican culture is African and that because Africans were here before Europeans,
So are these Afrocentric scholars? Are these scholars or are these regular individuals?
they have a superior claim to the continent. I've also personally heard it from many indigenous people that they find these notions very offensive, and that it feeds into this idea that Native Americans were incapable of creating their own civilization, of creating their own high culture. And you have to remember with this, there's been a lot of other racist, Eurocentric theories that have tried to appropriate Native American achievements. For example, mound building cultures and copperworking cultures in the Americas were attributed to white populations that lived in North America, only to be wiped out by the savage Indians. And this theory really, when people hear the theory that the Olmec were African and not indigenous, or that Olmec civilization is an African civilization, like that theory doesn't sound any different to them. It's just replacing a racist Eurocentric narrative with an Afrocentric narrative.
That's such. I'm gonna try to be respectful. That is so bad. Like, because again, you have to assume that both sides are practicing culture, historical archaeology, or diffusion, which they're not. Then you have to assume that isolationism, which Kamugisha wrote about this, James Blount wrote about it. James Blount, who's an Americanist, who did agree that Africans reached the Americas before Columbus. He wrote about how diffusionism is a Eurocentric from the West, from a Western argument. Its epistemology is from Westerners trying to explain how Western culture spread so rapidly with respect to colonialism. So it was an archaeological, working back from your conclusion, model and paradigm to explain the persistence of, or the rapid expansion of, European material culture all over the world, right? Basically them trying to justify that and say that it was ubiquitous through history using culturkris or cultural area. So to say that, African-centered scholars do that when it's rooted, Africana scholarship, Africana archaeology specifically, is rooted in Antenor Furman's positivist approach, rooted in, William Leo Hansberry, rooted in, Sheikh Anta Diop, who did a lot of new archaeological and processual methodologies. To claim that as the same as diffusionism is insane. To claim that Africans are trying to steal Native American culture is insane when Sertima literally said in the video that they just played that these are Native Americans, these are indigenous people who contacted and they fused with the Olmecs, right? So I just think that that's ridiculous. Now, if he's referring to the Abos, if he's talking about Abos, then, like I said, Americanist scholarship actually helps the Abos. The Abos are anti-African, and they're more likely to say that we're Melanesian, like autochthonous, type of people. We're Melanesian, we're Australian Aborigine. So they want to deny Africa in the same way that, Thomas Lynch and Blau and even Wuthenau's scholars, peers, said that they're more amenable to, Melanesians and Asiatic dark-skinned people coming to the Americas, but not Africans, because that harms the paradigm of white supremacy. You see what I'm saying? So, like, if he's talking about Abos, Americana scholarship actually helps the Abos more than Africana scholarship, right? Let's keep it going.
Before moving on, I think you brought up a great point, and I want to actually touch on this real quick and bring up a topic that many lovers and students of African history will be very well familiar with, and that is Great Zimbabwe, an amazing accomplishment of African culture and civilization. When it was first discovered, there were many racist and Eurocentric narratives pushed forward that, Africans, and especially Black Africans, could never possibly build such a great structure as this. And so, in that context, you all know how frustrating that is, how wrong that is to have someone try to say they didn't do it when we know that they did.
It's a pathos, and again, it's straw man. None of these scholars, like if he's talking about scholars, no African-centered scholar has ever claimed that Native Americans did not play a prominent role in these civilizations, if not create the majority of these civilizations themselves. Their position is contact. That's their position. So for you to try to, I know he's not doing it, and he, again, Mr. Barksdale is not here to defend himself, but I'm just saying, like, to draw that comparison, especially in the absence of a Africana scholar, is negligent, to say the least. That's very, very negligent. Because even Martin Bernal, in his defense of Ivan van Sertima, he defended him against the charge. Like, the very charge that he's making is a charge that Ann Cipher made at the Current Anthropology 1997 forum. where she said that, oh, Surnamer's argument, the Africana argument is that Native Americans are unable to build civilization by themselves. And Martin Bernal, in his reading of the text, said, no, that's not the argument. The argument is interconnectedness. The argument is mutual exchange. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Even if you look at Z maize, Africana scholars spoke ad nauseum about how corn, or Z maize, was used on pottery sherd impressions in Ile Ife before Columbus. So Ile Ife in Yoruba land, they had access to corn before Columbus, right? That's crystal clear. That's very, very clear. So this analogy is just fraudulent. And they've been making it throughout the video.
And so I want to reshift focus now on the Americas. And so we can see the exact same pain and frustration that the indigenous peoples of this country, of these countries, feel when other people appropriate that history as their own. And so now I want to approach this theory, the theory that Olmec civilization has an African origin. And so now I want to ask, what is the most important thing to remember about this theory?
What we need to remember is that this theory is just that, a theory. And frankly, not a very good one that's held up over time.
It's a contact model. Mesoamericanist, Mesoamericanists may consider it just a theory, but Africana scholars ubiquitously, almost unanimously accept this as a contact model in affirming that Africans indeed contacted the Americas before Columbus. This has been affirmed.
Now, I want to take a minute to say something very, very clearly. I'm not arguing that Africans could not have sailed to the Americas. They absolutely could have. They had everything they needed to do so. Maritime experience, technology, those favorable equatorial currents that go from West Africa to the Americas. Honestly, I'd be very surprised if no Africans ever went to the shores of the Americas. I'm sure a few of them had to have ended up there. Strictly speaking, that voyage that Ivan Van Sertima theorized could have happened, but just because something is possible.
So he's saying that, yeah, he'd be surprised if Africans didn't come before Columbus. I'm glad he admitted that. I'm glad he admitted that.
And feasible doesn't mean that it happened. That doesn't meet the burden of proof. I mean, if you're in court, you shouldn't convict someone solely because they had the means to do the crime.
And also, I'm surprised that he doesn't mention how Columbus himself described African canoes in the Americas. Columbus, in his own literature, he saw African canoes on the islands of the Caribbean in the Americas, right? So, not only is it plausible, according to Columbus's own records, African ships were in the Americas.
You need evidence that ties them to that crime. If a large voyage, sailed from Africa to the New World and, established a colony and this thriving culture that spread all over Mesoamerica, the proof should be there. It should be forthcoming. It should be easy to find. But as I said earlier, as time has gone on, new discoveries, new research, new data don't bear that out. Now, to illustrate, to kind of give some counterexamples, to kind of illustrate what I mean by the evidence that we should look for, I want to talk about some instances of pre-Columbian contact that have much better evidence associated with them. First, let's take a look at Norse contact with North America.
So right here, he's going to say that the Norse did it and the Polynesians did it because there's more evidence. I'm going to just let him rock. I'm going to respond after the fact.
Now, in the early 20th century, scholars who'd read those Viking sagas, the journeys of Leif Erikson, they theorized that those voyages of Leif Erikson, down in Vinland and stuff, they speculated that may have been North America, the North Atlantic coast. Now, at the time, when people started voicing those ideas, scholars pointed out correctly, that there was no proof of that, and that those sagas, may have been recounting, semi-legendary voyages, or that they weren't entirely historically accurate, that they might have been embellished, and that's where everything remained until the discovery of Lanzo Meadows in the 1960s. For those that don't know, Lanzo Meadows is an archaeological site that is a Viking settlement, a seasonal settlement that the Vikings used during their exploration. Now, at the site, we can tell easily that, these are Viking houses. The tools that are recovered there are Viking tools, nothing else. There's evidence of, ironworking that was done there, and, no indigenous culture in the Americas ever had ironworking. When you consider all of that, it's hard to claim that this is anything but a Norse settlement. Nothing else really fits the bill. It's diagnostically a Norse settlement. That lends a lot of evidence and a lot of credibility to the idea that the Norse were in America before Columbus. Everything lines up very nicely. Now, a second example that I want to look at that's actually a bit more recent is Polynesian contact with South America. Now, similar to Norse contact, there's kind of been a lot of people who have voiced ideas that there may have been contact between the Polynesians and the indigenous people of South America. And the linchpin of this argument is basically that the sweet potato was cultivated by Polynesian people. The sweet potato is not an old world crop. It's not, it's not a native crop to like Asia or the Pacific. It's only native to the Americas. So, how that crop got out there was kind of the big question. Now, like I mentioned before, with bottle gourds and cotton, sweet potato could have easily, washed out in like a raft, washed up on the beach of some island, and then been taken and cultivated by the local people there. It in itself is not proof that people spread the sweet potato into the Pacific. It could be incidental. But just recently, there was a genetic study done of Polynesians that showed that there was Native American ancestry and heritage dating back to about 800 years ago. And, the only way that can happen is if those peoples come together. Presumably some Polynesians hit South America, made friends with the locals. A Polynesian man and woman must have met up, had kids. Those kids went back to Polynesia and, carried, those American genes with them through their descendants. In this instance, that genetic evidence is very solid. There really isn't any other way to explain it. It lends a lot of credence to the idea that that Polynesian people made contact with the ancient Americas. Now, if you kind of compare those to, Van Serma's theory and others' theory, the kind of proof that you would want to see, archaeological proof, genetic proof, it's just not there. Instead, what we're left with is just, these, similarities that...
No, it is there. I mean, you just discount it. He spent all this time discounting all of the crops alone, right? He just discounted them without looking at the scholarship and the debates surrounding them. And as I said, I got 1 out of 10 right now. If I get 10 out of 10, I'm going to show y'all the archaeological evidence that pretty much puts this to bed, by the Mexican scholar, the indigenous, well-respected Mexican scholar who put this entire argument to bed, right? I got 1 out of 10, a Cash App will go a long way. The Super Chat will go a long way. If y'all want to see the evidence. And if you're a member, you're going to see it anyway. But if y'all want to see the evidence, like I said, a Cash App and a Super Chat will go a long way. We will continue.
That OLMEC culture has to African culture. The people who push these theories, they'll always tell you that this has to be a result of contact. There's no way on earth that this is parallel development. When we have many examples of parallel development within history. It's it's nothing exceptional. And for the record, if somebody ever does find the African version of Lanzo Meadows, if they ever find an archaeological site with African artifacts in the America, that would lend those theories a lot of credit. Until then, there's not much to go on. If they ever do discover it, I'm making an episode the next day to cover it because that's gonna be the coolest discovery ever.
Yeah, Wuthanau. When Wuthanau gave his terracottas, they said they were all fake. And the source that they use is Robbing Native American Cultures, Hazabir, Montiano, and Barber. And the source that they use to discount Wuthanau is a personal conversation. So they don't have museum curators look at his artifacts and say which one's real and which one's not. They just have a personal conversation from archaeologists, Americanist archaeologists, who state, yeah, we think it's fake. But they never prove that any of Wuthanau's artifacts were fake or forgeries. That's never been proven. At least I haven't seen any evidence of it. So he's asking for evidence, but then when somebody shows it, when you show Hull Bay African remains from the 12th century, when you show Libyan script who's confirmed by David Kelly in the same area in Reef Bay in the U.S. Virgin Islands, definitively proving that Africans came to the Americas before Columbus, right? They just discount it. So there's more evidence for the African presence than the Viking presence. But the Americanist, as we stated before, if we look into this, there is a hierarchy of disbelief among Americanists, right? They accept European contact, they're tenuous on Asian contact, and they reject African contact out of hand. So this scholar here is literally promoting the Americanist hierarchy of disbelief. As we suspected, it's really a joke, honestly. And like, Kieran said, there's no amount of evidence that you can provide that they'll accept. They'll just discount it. They'll just continue to discount it. They won't accept, like the General Service Administration, this is a U.S. agency, even published, those 13th century, mid 13th century African remains in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The Libyan Society of Antiquities literally confirms that the Libyan or Tifinagh writing system is present in the Americas, in the U.S. Virgin Island before Columbus. So literally, so many different independent scholars have verified this, but they just, literally museum curators call Monument F El Negro. They call Monument F Black Man. Not enough data, not enough evidence. So, we went over this ad nauseum, and, they won't accept it.
From books that advocate pseudoscience to online forums, we see the perpetuation of this unsupported claim. Now, I have to ask, why the obsession?
I'm not sure how good of an answer I can give to this since I personally don't endorse this theory. Obviously, I'm white. I don't want to assume why Africans, enjoy this theory. I can certainly appreciate how the idea of, one's ancestors making ancient voyages to unknown lands can capture the imagination. But, for all I know, that means different things to different people. One element that I will point out is that Dr. Van Serma was a very prominent African scholar in academia. And that academia was largely white when he released his work. And so when a lot of scholars attack his ideas, I think that, the proponents of that theory, the supporters, the way that they see it is they see it as a mainly white academia trying to suppress, this African history. And in all fairness, I mean, white scholars have historically tried to marginalize African achievements and culture, so it is an understandable reaction, that you would kind of guard this theory and keep it close to your chest because it's under attack. That said, I think things are much better in academia today. I think African culture does have much more respect now than it did, 50, 60 years ago. Obviously, it could use a lot more respect. It doesn't get its due. It doesn't really, punch, at its weight. And there are definitely hard feelings because of that, and a lot of resentment that's built up around it from, that racist scholarship that's been there in the past.
As we move away from this theory to the end of our episode, I have to ask, in the future, in terms of academia, African history, indigenous American history, how do we move forward from this?
Well, for what little weight my opinion carries, I think the best thing that we can do at this point is just to raise awareness and just educate people on what the faults of this theory are. I think it's also important to let indigenous people speak on the issue because ultimately they're the victims here. It's their heritage that's being appropriated. At the end of the day, they're going to voice their concerns, their objections far better than I ever can. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind is that ultimately, this is a much bigger argument than ourselves, and it's important to empower, the people that are under attack as much as possible. After all, it's their heritage that's being appropriated.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been joined today by Pete from Ancient Americas, a phenomenal YouTube channel that I cannot encourage you enough to subscribe to and support. After all, even I am subscribed to Ancient Americas, and I rarely subscribe to history channels on YouTube. And so for that fact alone, I'm telling you, you have to go to his channel, check out his awesome work, and honestly, give him your support in helping him make history matter. Coming up right after this segment, we're going to be joined by geneticist and channel favorite, Razib Khan, to walk us through what DNA has shown us on the OLMECs and who they were and where they came from. But before we do that, Pete, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We are joined once again by geneticist Razib Khan. Mr. Khan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, my pleasure, Nick.
To follow up on the OLMECs, we explained the Afrocentric theories that surround the subject as to who they were and whether or not there is an African origin to Olmec civilization. But to further set the record straight, I wanted to bring Mr. Khan on to talk about your favorite subject, and that is ancient DNA and how it shapes the history that we have today. And so, Mr. Khan, before we begin, would you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
So my name is Razib Khan. I am a geneticist. In my offline work, I work in the private sector in biotech and genomics and genetics. But online, you can find me at my Substack, razib.substack.com, where I talk about genetics history of other topics that where I think you and I, Nick, have a meeting of the minds. And you can find all my stuff at razib.com. I do contribute to other publications like Unheard, National Review, etc., book reviews and whatnot.
And before we get started, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the awesome work that Mr. Khan is doing that better help people like me and you better understand the past that we all love. And as someone who's actually subscribed to his Substack, I honestly can't recommend it enough. From Bronze Age archaeologists like Dr. Eric Klein to the very topics that fascinate us all, including the Indo-Europeans, the history of the steppes, Mr. Khan provides a Substack that has something for everyone. And now we're going to discuss the DNA of the Olmecs.
Yeah, so I think the issue here is, part of it is, I don't think we have DNA directly from the Olmecs. What we need to do is kind of get them in the scaffold of the genomic history of the Americas, which has been established now. So there's several things we need to talk about when we talk about ancient people who don't have written records. One thing is the archaeology. Another issue is the paleontology. As paleontology, I'm talking about skeletons, right? And then we're talking about DNA. The DNA has come along recently, but now these three things can be brought together to kind of create a scaffold of the population history. To understand Mexico, I think, because we don't have a huge ancient DNA transect yet, what you need to do is get the genetic variation of Mexicans today and understand it in the context of the genetic variation of the Americas as a whole that we have. So most of your listeners know that there's a hypothesis of people in the New World coming across over the Bering Strait on the order of 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, closer to 15. But in any case, that makes some predictions in relation to the genetics, okay? So most people in the New World who have indigenous ancestry, they have detectable indigenous ancestry, so we can look at Mexico. So there's a group, Maria Avila in Mexico runs it. She was trained as a postdoc at Stanford. They've looked at all of the genetic variation of people in Mexico, and Mexicans are a mixture of three primary groups. One group is Europeans, mostly Iberians. The other group is Africans, mostly people from South or West Africa. And the last group is the indigenous people of the New World, correct? So what they found is the structure of variation of Mexicans of the indigenous ancestry is geographically differentiated. That means that if you're a Mexican from Oaxaca, or you're a Mexican from Jalisco, your indigenous ancestry is different. Okay, that means that the variation of the Nahua people in the south and the Pima people in the north, all these different ethnic groups, it's maintained in modern day Mexicans. Because, when European settlers came, mostly men, they married local women, and the local women were from that region. So what this is telling us is that you can recapitulate the genetic variation of Mexicans from their ancestors who lived there before 1492, okay? Who are those ancestors? So this is what we know. There are a fair number of ancient remains from the New World. So a lot of your listeners will know about Kennewick Man. In Kennewick, Washington, there was a lot of controversy over the identity of Kennewick Man. When you looked at the skull of Kennewick Man, paleontologists, anthropologists, they thought it looked more like maybe Southeast Asian, Ainu, or even European. This caused an enormous amount of controversy at the time. Here's the issue. When you look at skulls, when you look at skeletons, those are subject to variation within populations. There are always people that are at one end of the distribution for their population, and so you don't know if they're represented. When you look at a genome, what you're doing is you're sampling a whole pedigree, their whole ancestral information. So they have gotten genetic data out of populations in the region of Kennewick Man and Kennewick Man. Okay? And what they have found is those individuals are pretty much ancestral to the type of population you see in the New World that we label indigenous. And those individuals seem to be distantly related to Siberians. Okay? And just for your listener and viewer, I want to be kind of like a little in the weeds here in detail. So these people who arrived from Siberia are not the Siberians of today. They're a more ancient population that lived in Siberia before more recent demographic transitions and transformations of Pleistocene and Holocene, the last 15,000 years. So about 60 to 70% of the ancestry of the people of the New World is much more closely related to Han Chinese and Japanese than any other world population of East Asians. But 30 to 40% of their population is what we call Paleo-Siberian or ancient North Eurasian. And this genetic ancestry component is not particularly closely related to East Asians. It's very, very distantly related to the peoples of West Eurasia. So the Ket people of, say, Central Siberia are the example of people that have a high portion of this ancestry. It turns out that about like 10 to 15% of the ancestry of Europeans is also Paleo-Siberian, as well as a similar proportion in South Asia, in the Caucasus. So these Paleo-Siberian people had a huge impact all across the world by mixing with people to their east, Native American ancestors, and people to their west, some part European, Indo-European, whatnot. The dominant Y chromosomal lineage of the New World is Q.
And that Y chromosome lineage is the, quote, brother lineage to R, which is the dominant one in Europe and South Asia. And so that tells you that that's probably Paleo-Siberian men. So if I had a hypothesis, it would be Paleo-Siberian males seem to have mixed with a population with a lot of East Asian females, and then eventually crossed over into Beringia, which is, lost civilization, now lost territory. And what happened around 15,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum abated, and they moved westward. A small population moved westward. And all Native Americans, they do seem to be descended from this ancestral population, with one exception. There are some populations in South America, particularly in Amazonia, that are distantly related to the people of the Andaman Islands in Australia. And we don't really know what's going on here. Geneticists are not gods. There's some things that just can't be explained yet. And this has been confirmed with ancient DNA from Brazil. Like they did find an individual with this weird, unexplained population cluster. So, there are some unexplained mysteries, but we have not detected any African-like populations in the New World, to my knowledge. And African populations are very, very genetically distinct. The separation between African populations and non-African populations occurred anywhere between 60 to 200,000 years ago, depending on the African population that you are, thinking of. So, for example, West Africans, the most likely donor population in the New World, and the donor population, the African diaspora in the New World, diverged from Eurasians on the order of 60 to 100,000 years ago. And so they show up when they show up in the ancient DNA. They're very clear. They're very distinct. And to my knowledge, we don't see any of this in the New World samples before 1492. There are some mysteries, though, in this field. We don't know everything, so we do need to keep an open mind and expect to be surprised. There are arguments now about how long ago modern humans lived in the New World, and there's a site in Mexico that might date to before 20,000 years, before the last glacial maximum. And so we don't know where those people are. There's a hypothesis that if this is correct, and there's arguments among archaeologists about this site, and I can't wade into that. That's not my field. If this is correct, we might be able to understand this mysterious third component ancestry in South America. Maybe there are people here earlier. We don't know. So there are mysteries out there, just not the mysteries that sometimes are propounded, by some scholars and thinkers.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today at the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages, where we took you through what DNA can.
Yeah, so Yerrick is right. This is a far right. That was a far right individual, and we've spoken about how genetics has flaws. There's flaws. There's S&P arrays that are biased in the direction of Eurasians. Most of the genetic diversity is African, but most of the classified markers are non-African, which doesn't really make any sense. And again, he's saying that there's no evidence of any African genetic material in Mesoamerica. We went over this, Harvard's AADR version 9. 5th millennia BCE individual from Sakizul, Belize, has BTM91. Right? Prove that. Same thing. I-13-200 from El Soco, Dominican Republic, 9th century, AADR V9, BTM91. The ancient DNA explorer in Chichen Itza, 9th century, YCH25, YCH26, and YCH38, BTM182 and BTM91 respectively. So the claim that there is no genetic material in Mesoamerica pre-Columbus from Africa is debunked, completely debunked.
Can tell us not only about the ancient Americas, but specifically OLMEC civilization and some of the issues we are still facing today to solve this story. Don't forget, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the hard work that he is doing and really give Mr. Khan your full support. Mr. Khan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Nick.
We are joined today by Dr. Ivan Oransky. Dr. Oransky, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For our audience today, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a journalist. I'm a doctor by training, but more than 20 years ago now, I decided to go into journalism full time. So didn't stray that far. I cover pretty much medical, scientific subjects, trying to make use of the rather long and expensive education that I had in my sort of teens and 20s. And I co-founded a bit more than a decade ago something called Retraction Watch, which, as the name implies, takes a look at scientific retractions, academic scholarly work, and that is what's known as peer review. In other words, this isn't just random stuff.
Yeah, he's gonna talk about the paper, the OLMEC paper that we reviewed, and he's gonna get into that about why it was retracted. And our take was it really shouldn't have been. The journal probably should have had it list competing views or competing frameworks, but I didn't see anything too crazy about the article. The article actually looked pretty straightforward and simple to me. It didn't even really go as deep as we go on this channel, so I didn't really think that it was too crazy.
Stuff on the internet or even mass media material like I might write. It's these are journals. And Adam Marcus, who's my co-founder, and I have been doing that for more than a decade now, and it's sort of turned into certainly what we're known for, and in many ways where our brains live, at least on nights and weekends. And sort of along the way, I've had a number of roles in other places. Right now, I'm the editor-in-chief of Spectrum, which is a website for autism researchers about scientific research about autism. And I also teach journalism, medical journalism at NYU.
And so now I'd like to talk about your project, Retraction Watch, for our audience today who may not be familiar with it and what it does, what you all do there. Would you tell us a little bit about that project?
Retractions are, if you will, the sort of nuclear option in correction in science. They mean when you see a paper that's been retracted, you see a retraction notice, or you see a big watermark over a paper that says retracted, that means, hey, reader, you should not consider this paper, this material reliable anymore. And that can happen for a number of reasons. It can happen for misconduct or fraud. It can happen for honest error. It can happen for plagiarism. It can happen for all sorts of reasons, some of which are sort of strange and have to do with academia and scientific publishing. But a little more than a decade ago, Adam Marcus and I noticed that retractions were basically a big untold story. Adam had written about, he'd broken the story of someone named Scott Rubin, who was a anesthesiology researcher. So he studied pain management, essentially. And he was pretty well thought of. The studies he did were quoted and cited by a lot of other research. The issue was, and you can understand how this became an issue, even though it seems kind of minor, he was making up all the patients in all those trials. So these were all fake results. And that's obviously fraudulent. It's misconduct. I mean, long story short, he ended up going to federal prison for charges related to that, which is pretty unusual. And so Adam, because he was at the time editor-in-chief of something called Anesthesiology News, which I always tell them I always tell the publisher they should have a tagline that says the magazine for people who put other people to sleep, but they don't seem to have gotten to that idea, so oh well. But in all seriousness, he had broken the story because he knew all the anesthesiologists and all the researchers and all the editors and all the rest of it. And so when he published all this, and I knew Adam at the time, not as well as I do now, of course, I followed this with, avidly. It was just great reading. He had broken a big story, had lots of consequences. And I said to him one day, what if we blog about retractions? We talk about them periodically, and we trade emails, and it looks like nobody else is really covering them. And wow, there are all these great stories hiding in plain sight. And oh, by the way, all the retraction notices, so it's sort of like little notice that runs along with the retraction, like here's what actually happened. Often they're misleading or opaque or they don't exist. And so that's a transparency problem for science. And so we started that in August 2010, and very quickly couldn't keep up with all the retractions. It turns out we had no idea quite how many there were. We do now, and have just been writing about them ever since. We have a database of retractions that we launched a few years ago. That is the most comprehensive database of retractions. It has getting close to 29,000 retractions in it now. Going back as far as 1756, it turns out, a retraction involving someone who was criticizing Ben Franklin. I mean, it's pretty interesting historically. And so we, and we've been doing that ever since, and just having a great time, frankly. But I think we like to think that we are really encouraging and even providing space for a conversation around scientific publishing, around fraud and misconduct in science, around transparency, around some other related issues. It's just a lot of fun. That's for sure.
And now let's talk about the subject that's the very premise for this episode, and that is the OLMECs. While researching this episode, I came across an article written by you, which was titled Journal Retracts Paper Claiming That Group of Indigenous Americans Were Black Africans. And so I'd like to ask, when and how did this retraction catch your attention?
We learned about this retraction the way we learned about, it's not uncommon anyway, maybe not most retractions, and that was that someone tweeted about it. Somebody tagged us into a Twitter thread and said, hey, you should know about this. We looked at it and it looked pretty interesting. I mean, there are now more than 2,000 retractions a year, and not all of them are that interesting. And we have to make choices about which ones to cover. Anyway, this one looked pretty interesting because it was sort of about sort of fundamental, historical contention, if you will. I mean, it was actually not just, someone fudged a little data here or something like that. It didn't actually look like anyone had done anything involving misconduct or fraud, but it was sort of like, oh, wait, I to be honest, I hadn't even heard of this whole controversy. If you want to call it controversy. I'm always careful about calling something a controversy when in fact it's pretty clear what's going on. It's just that some people are coming up with ideas that frankly just aren't supported. So I looked at it, I thought it was interesting, and I saw in this Twitter thread a link to a pretty, I thought, devastating critique of the original paper, which we always like to see because it helps us understand the context. And so basically it looked to us, and again, we're not historians, we're not experts in really anything except maybe retractions. It looked to us as though this paper had, according to these critics, had gotten it wrong, had made certain assumptions, had sort of followed a particular narrative that has been, best I can tell, largely discredited, that this group of people known as the OLMECs were not, their culture had actually been sort of, given to them, all of their traditions and what have you, by a group of Africans who had come to, what we now call America. This is, hundreds, thousands of years before, frankly, the slave trade. In other words, that's, where, of course, the incredibly large and tragic migration came from, but this was before that. And so the idea was that this culture was really a Black African culture. And it's based on some, what look like misinterpretations, if I'm being sort of generous, that I think, an historian or an anthropologist, cultural, someone, an expert in that, a scholar in that would be much better placed to explain than I can. But essentially, based on some very thin evidence that if you look at some of the statues of this particular, of the OLMECs, they bear, I would say more than a passing resemblance, the facial features to what you would expect from, African, immigrants, migrants to North America. But what is ignored apparently in a lot of that narrative and in that thread is that they also look exactly like they have the features of other peoples, particularly those from Central America or the southern part of North America, groups that live, in and around, what we now call Mexico. And so the point is there are other explanations, there are parsimonious, right? So other explanations for what these particular historians, these scholars were claiming, they were being ignored. And in scholarship, certainly, particularly in history, as I'm sure your viewers know, it's not that we know X, Y, or Z are absolutely true. It's just that when you come up with an idea, or when you write a paper, you write a scholarly paper that is again peer reviewed, it's looked at by experts, in your field who can judge whether or not the claims are correct or at least, supportable, evidence-based. You are supposed to include, sort of limitations of your analysis. You're supposed to include these are other explanations for what we're seeing, and that's, in a good, for example, trial, a human clinical trial of a new drug, or more to the point, we watched 100 people eat this and asked 100 people what they ate, this sort of thing. There are other explanations for why people who eat broccoli tend to be healthier, other than maybe something in broccoli. It could be that those people also maybe are less likely to smoke, or maybe they exercise more, or whatever else, right? And so there are other explanations that you're kind of obligated, at least if you want to be a good scholar, to include, and those were not included. And then the paper then made a sort of recommendation that this particular narrative be taught in schools, which is I think where this captured a lot more attention among historians and social studies researchers. And so we learned about it, as we often do, after the retraction. In other words, here's the paper was retracted, then we sort of unspooled the narrative almost post hoc, sort of retrospectively, and then end up trying to put together what actually happened best we can, and try to get people to talk to us on every quote unquote side of the story. The authors, et cetera, they didn't call us back, but the record from the critics was pretty clear. They had published something. They'd actually published a, again, what I think of as a pretty well-argued blog post about it.
You pointed out when I look at these, OLMEC statues, people I see are people in South and Central America. There's so many outdated and Eurocentric anthropological aspects to what they're claiming. If they look at that and they say, obviously that has Black facial features. My issue with that is, in a sense, it is still relying on this outdated, attempts to basically classify people. If that makes sense. That's one thing that I'm like, it's like, right, we think we push Asked.
There's also this, I mean, I think there's I don't want to get too far ahead of the evidence here, but one other aspect of this that I think is at least worth considering is the notion of what we refer to as confirmation bias or motivated reasoning, right? So you sort of tend to see things the way and interpret sort of events and reasons for events according to your own experience and according to your own biases. And people, I think, and this is something I had to learn as I was doing, getting to know the world that we cover in terms of retraction watch. Word bias, when in common usage, is pretty negative, right? Like you're biased. You are biased against this group of people, or you're biased against something in the world. In science, it actually is it's much closer to almost value neutral. Like bias just means usually, in fact, it refers to what we might call in common parlance unconscious bias. Now, those have negative effects, absolutely, but there isn't an intentionality. There isn't an assumption that it is because someone intended to be biased. It is just that methods can be biased. Methods aren't even people. And so again, it could be a historical method. It could be a lab test. Tests are biased. When you talk about false positives, false negatives, those are examples of biases, which again should be taken into account. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use the test. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do this kind of analysis. You should take into account what else could be explaining what I'm looking at. When you think about confirmation bias, think about bias in general. I often think about a quote from Richard Feynman, right? Very famous scientist as well as science communicator, and he was quoted as saying, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool." Right? So we all want certain things to be true, even if we're not aware of it. Right? We all try and rationalize decisions we make or conclusions we come to, and a lot of time that's either harmless or even adaptive. But when you go into a narrative, you go into findings, you go into research, knowing, thinking you know what the answer is, or even unconsciously knowing the answer, you're not going. It's like tunnel vision is like putting blinders on. You're not going to see what's actually happening, and that again, it happens in all aspects of human life. It happens, when you have a phone call with someone, you get off the phone, and because of some inflection in his or her voice, and you assume that they now hate you, or they think that you're the devil or some awful thing. It turns out they were walking around with the phone and they stubbed their toe. It had nothing to do with you, and they were a little annoyed because they stubbed their toe and they probably sounded a little, frankly pissed off. It had nothing to do with you, but because you don't have the entire picture, and because we're not thinking through what the alternative explanations are or could be, which is what basically happened here with this retraction. You're going to have just a skewed version of the world. And, it's just something that we think about a lot and write about a lot, or at least it informs our work very often, this sort of notion of confirmation bias or motivated reasoning.
To my subscribers, don't forget, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the awesome work that Dr. Oransky is doing, including the website Retraction Watch, so you can really...
Yeah, so we cool off that. So essentially, like I said, the Wigan article, I think that should have been reinstated, to be honest. We went over just some of the main points, and as I stated before, this is pretty clear, and I think we've done a good job this series. I actually thought, because I had seen this video for quite some time, but I never really watched it, and I actually thought I was going to get a lot more from it, but I thought wrong. It really was kind of basic, and it was really easy for me just to go through my slides and just refute the things that he was saying. So I just want y'all to remember that, the Americanist perspective is not the same as the Africanist perspective at all. Or it's not the same as the Africana perspective. Americanists and Africanists, these white experts on American and African cultures and languages, right? They act as if they're the universal arbiter of truth, but they're not. They're absolutely not. Not at all. So, this has been, I don't really know what more to say. Now, I will, like I said, I'm going to release the Mexican scholars research to members, Patreon and YouTube members. So if you are a Patreon or YouTube member, you will receive that video. For everybody else, shout out to y'all for tuning in, and I'm gonna play my outro, and I'm gonna catch y'all on the next one. Let's get it.
Nasceu a história que grita, OLMECs pretos, raízes que agitam, rostos talhados, lábios que contam na terra. A força africana brota, os OLMECs eram pretos, oh sim, carregam no rosto o poder que não tem fim. De África ao mundo a verdade vai brilhar. Ivan falou e o povo vai lembrar. Do Atlântico veio o vento que guia, de terras distantes a sabedoria vivia. No barril, na pedra, a alma resistia. Pretos e fortes, sua marca persistia. Escuta o tambor, o eco do passado. Ivan nos mostrou O legado é sagrado, os OLMECs eram pretos. Oh sim, carregam no rosto o poder que não tem fim. De África ao mundo a verdade vai brilhar. Ivan falou e o povo vai lembrar. Oh, lábios grossos, narizes que falam nosso DNA, o tempo não cala. Desenhos antigos, histórias marcadas. Preto é poder, raízes guardadas.
Shout out to everybody in the building. Appreciate y'all for supporting. You know, if you want to support me again, you can hit me on the Cash App, you know, $Conjiverse. Become a member, you know, of the YouTube or the Patreon. Your support goes a long way. You know, shout out to everybody in the building. Appreciate y'all for tuning in.